than, say, you know, my teacher as an undergrad, Hans Sennholz, or, you know, Murray Rothbard or whatnot. Precisely because Sennholz and Rothbard eschewed the profession completely. But Bryan actually argues that the radical subjectivist and the entrepreneurial perspective is incoherent. It's kind of an interesting twist. Because the very people who everyone thought were like the ones that are the most sort of successful, he argues, are the most incoherent. And the ones who everyone thinks are the least successful and the most dogmatic are the most coherent but wrong. See, so he flips the debate. It's like, oh, going, you know, it's actually, to someone like me, it's very interesting because it's like my brain gets blown up. Bryan provides a brain quake, like this, right, to my head, because it's like, how can you possibly think that? But, you know, he does. And so the question is why is that the case? And I think that he put his finger on it at the end of his talk, which I completely agree with, is that the problem with a lot of those people, these subjectivists and entrepreneurial perspectives, is they made their argument at such an abstract level and in reference to an abstract model. The abstract model being Arrow-Hahn-DeBrugh model. And they made it in reference to that, that what ended up by happening was they're not any touch to reality. So I agree completely with Bryan that if Austrians want to prove them to be more robust than other sort of approaches to economics, they should in fact be radically empirical and show the demonstration of their effects in economic history and things like that. And I think one of the biggest problems with the Rothbard branch of Austrian economics is it convinces young people that they don't have to do history. Even though Rothbard did more history than anyone else, they talk about this idea as if, like, I can spin out all of economic theory without ever looking at the world. As I said, I'm not being as charming as Bryan, so you have to bear with me in being boring. So I'm being boring tonight. And the reason is, I think there's a space in economic science that's vital for the defense of a free society. See, there's a connection here. What Bryan, I don't believe that natural rights, I'm going to be ideological for a second, I don't believe natural rights can carry the load of a defense of a free society. The defense of a free society has to come from economic science. Okay? Now that's a normative purpose of a positive science. All right, so I admit that you have to have some various different normative, subsidiary assumptions in there to get from that. But you have to have economic science as to do it. And if you don't allow for certain space about the role of institutions and in particular liberty, you're not going to end up by getting that defense. And here's the way that space, I think that it's you can divide the world up into a problem situation and outcomes in the world. Simple, complex. Okay? In a simple world, right? So to say, think of when you're in economics class, perfect competition model. The outcomes of that fall, this is where the domain of standard neoclassical theory lies. Over here, the critics of economics in general, people like, Marxists, institutionalists, they argue we're pretty screwed up even in the most simple of worlds. Right? Things don't really work out so well even in the simplest of worlds. Standard neoclassical market failure theory argue introduce some subsidiary assumptions which move us away from a simple problem situation, and we end up with market failure. And it's my contention that there's a group of economists, Austrians of whom are probably among those who are prominent, but what would now be called new institutional economics in general, which in fact finds space here, which is that, you can in fact find very efficient outcomes within very complicated problem situations. Problem situations which challenge our cognitive capabilities to cope with it. Why? How do we do it? The argument comes back to institutions. It's an issue of institutional intelligence. Let me give an example of to show the relationship with neoclassical economics. The marginalist principles come out of a process. They're not an assumption going in. The institutions weed behaviors out. People are pretty stupid. Or they're lazy. They're not homo economicus. But what prods them to act in a certain way is the institutional environment within which they behave. If you have an institutional environment in which their bad beliefs are not penalized, they're going to hold on to those bad beliefs. Oops, I just made an argument Bryan Caplan makes. It's an argument that comes out of Austrian economics. It's not the sky is blue. It's an argument which comes out of our focus not on the behavioral assumptions of perfection, but instead on the institutions that allow us to cope with our cognitive imperfections. Okay, that's where Austrian economics lies. That's why the socialist calculation debate was interesting. It's not that the people in Russia are stupid. It's not that they don't try to equate marginal benefits with marginal costs. It's that within the institutional environment in which they're behaving, they're equating of those marginal costs and marginal benefits. They don't have enough signals to push them in a certain other direction, which would be consistent with quote-unquote economic efficiency in terms of the technological possibilities and the economic feasibilities. There's an interconnection between the knowledge problems and the incentive problems. So why would I argue that Caplan's an Austrian? First of all, what is Austrian economics? Austrian economics is an actor orientation in which beliefs generates actions and cognitive imperfections. And we recognize that the ongoing process of economic life is continuously unfolding. Economics is fundamentally about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. That's it. Austrian economics has no unique claim to this. It's just called catalactics. It goes all the way back to classical economics. Mises never said that the only people who ever thought good thoughts were those born in Vienna. He draws a line throughout the history of economics about all kinds of people who talk about exchange behavior. And that's what the main focus of Austrian economics is on. Exchange behavior and the institutions within which those exchanges take place. So despite my argument that I'm not going to try to push Bryan because if he's as a subjectivist, if Bryan says he's not an Austrian, he's not an Austrian, that's fine. By the way, Ludwig Lachmann was asked that one time about Hutt. You know, because Hutt described himself as an Austrian. So Hutt was like Bryan. But at that days, he thought it was cool to call himself an Austrian because there was kind of this revival going on. But Hutt, most of his career, he was just a good economist. He didn't really care about being an Austrian or not. But you know, there's this revival going on, so Hutt started saying, "Well, I'm an Austrian." And so, but he kind of was, he had some views that were kind of objectivistic views or something. So some Austrians were, you know, concerned about his views, and they asked Lachmann, who was the ultimate subjectivist, and they said, "Well, what do you think? Do you think Hutt, you know, is an Austrian?" And Lachmann said, you know, the subjectivist. If Professor Hutt says he's an Austrian, he's an Austrian. And so I'm saying the opposite. Bryan says he's not an Austrian, he's not an Austrian. But why would I argue that Bryan's an Austrian? First of all, I think, again, this is another thing. Questions. Questions are what drive research. And where do people come up with these questions? They come up with these questions because they read other people who ask questions. And then eventually, sometime down the road, you ask questions. So why is it that Bryan Caplan, of all people, would be one who would ask questions about rational stupidity? Just because, well, by the way, that would be a surprise. Right? A genuine, maybe, even. Right, it did surprise you because, in fact, it's a question which unfolds out of a long history of trying to deal with questions. So it's the kind of questions that are asked to you in certain things. Or is it a question it's a question that comes out of trying to understand